In the quiet and sacred space of Westminster Abbey, one autumn afternoon in 1396, the cool mist seemed to add to the solemnity of the ancient stone halls. An old priest stood silently, his hands clasped tightly around the prayer book, his eyes fixed on the bustling scene unfolding before him. Servants hurried back and forth, their voices whispering about an event that the entire court believed would be the strangest royal wedding England had ever witnessed. The bride, they said, had come from far away France, a princess, the daughter of King Charles himself. The priest had blessed countless marriages and held countless hands in sacred ceremonies, but never had he seen such a strange commotion. As the great heavy oak doors opened and the wedding party entered, the priest's eyes widened in stunned disbelief. The groom, King Richard II, aged 29, appeared regal, tall, and majestic, his golden hair catching the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. But beside him, holding his hand, was an impossibly small figure, a child barely up to the king's elbow, her tiny hand almost swallowed up in his gloved one. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, a little princess in a gorgeous French gown, her black hair braided with pearls that seemed too heavy for her small head. The priest had to hold on to the railing to steady himself. This was Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. Inwardly, the priest consoled himself with thoughts of the times in which he lived. He had seen brides of 12 or 13 years old. It was not uncommon. Political marriages were the norm among noble families, a bond of interest and power. Life was fragile, and short the specter of the Black Death that had swept through only 50 years earlier, taking half the population and leaving a constant reminder of impermanence. In such a world, kings had to forge alliances while they could, and marriages were a way to seal treaties more firmly than any scroll or seal. This was not a story of love, but of survival, of stability for an entire kingdom. But as the ceremony began, his gaze returned to the child's face. He saw no fear in those large dark eyes. Instead, there was a pure, innocent curiosity. She seemed to be taking in all the grandeur around her, from the soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candles, to the nobles in their finest silks and velvets. When King Richard spoke, his voice was gentle, almost protective. This was not a monster taking a child bride for his base desires. This was a king fulfilling his duty to his kingdom, securing peace with France through the most sacred of bonds. It was understood that the marriage would not be sealed for many years. The little queen would be raised and educated at the English court until she was fully grown. That was how it had always been done. In a steady voice, the priest blessed their union, though his heart beat strangely as he pronounced them man and wife. Watching the little girl become Queen of England, he could not help but wonder what fate awaited her in this dangerous game of royal politics. To understand how a child became the center of an international treaty, one must go back in time to the world where she was born. Isabella was born in November 1389, amid the splendor of the Louvre Palace in Paris, but her childhood was not as peaceful as its gilded walls. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was a tragic king. His reign was marked by bouts of madness, periods when the most powerful monarch in France became a different person, paranoid and fearful. There were times when he believed his body was made of glass and would shatter into pieces if anyone touched it. Isabella's childhood was thus unstable, as her father's love could turn to terror at any moment. Amidst this chaos, her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was a woman of complete contrast. Intelligent, ambitious, and extremely practical, she understood better than anyone that in this harsh political chessboard, her children were the most valuable pieces. Her eyes on Isabella were not only maternal love, but also the calculation of a politician knowing that one day her daughter's royal blood would be used to secure the safety of the entire kingdom. This was set against a larger and more devastating backdrop, the 100 Years' War. The conflict, which lasted nearly 6 decades, had left deep scars on both England and France. French villages lay in ruins after English raids, while England's coffers were depleted by the enormous costs of war. Both nations were weary soldiers, peasants, and nobles yearning for peace. From this shared exhaustion, a fragile desire for peace began to grow in both courts, and they needed a powerful symbol to make that dream a reality. And then, a personal tragedy across the Channel presented an opportunity. King Richard II of England was in mourning after the death of his beloved wife Anne of Bohemia. Her death had left him with not only an emotional void, but also a dangerous situation for the kingdom. The king had no heir. In the meantime, French diplomats had arrived with a bold proposal. They brought not only their princess, but also a huge dowry of 800,000 francs, and most importantly, the promise of a 28-year truce, long enough for a generation to grow up without the sound of swords. The offer was enticing, but there was one major drawback. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even in an era when child marriages were not uncommon, she was still too young, causing deep divisions within Richard's council. But the French diplomats cleverly turned this weakness into an advantage. They argued that her youth represented a new beginning, a completely clean sheet of paper, untainted by old grudges. Isabella would be raised at the English court, raised as an Englishwoman, and when she was old enough to be a proper wife, peace would be firmly rooted and unshakable. Perhaps it was this innocence and vulnerability that touched the heart of the grieving king. Richard, who had no children, may have seen in Isabella not just a political alliance, but also an opportunity for protection, a paternal role. Finally, the decision was made. The treaty was signed and the little princess's fate was sealed. But there was one crucial clause, one final protection for her childhood. All parties agreed that the marriage would not be sealed until Isabella reached physical maturity. It was an acknowledgement that before she was queen, she was still a child. And so, while little Isabella was playing with her dolls in the Louvre, unbeknownst to her, her future was written on parchment, sealed with wax and ribbon, and traded for the dream of peace between two great powers. Isabella's journey through England began not with a single event, but with 2 ceremonies of different significance. The first in Calais, an English enclave in France, had the air of a formal but somewhat private diplomatic meeting, where vows were exchanged as the final seals were sealed on a peace treaty. The coronation a year later in Westminster Abbey was a spectacular public spectacle. A huge curiosity gripped London, with crowds jostling to catch a glimpse of the child queen they had heard of. The entire ceremony was elaborate, from the streets decorated with English roses and French lilies to the crown specially made for her tiny head. It was not just a show of power, but also a carefully calculated political message, an attempt by the crown to make this unusual marriage seem reasonable and acceptable to the English people and nobility. Amidst the crowds and the extravagance, Isabella was a small symbol, a living entity of the fragile peace. Yet behind the public role of a symbolic queen, a more private and peaceful world opened up for Isabella and the architect of that world, was none other than her husband, King Richard II. He treated her not as a nominal wife or a political pawn, but with all the gentle kindness of a father and a protector. Richard often visited her rooms, bringing her gifts that were not only expensive, but also meaningful, such as exotic birds from Ireland, precious books from Oxford, or exquisitely crafted musical instruments. He showed a sincere interest in every aspect of her life, from her studies to her small entertainments. Gradually, Isabella's initial formality and shyness melted away, giving way to a genuine affection and trust. She began to look forward to the king's visits, seeing him as a source of comfort and the strongest protector in the strange palace. This special relationship created a bubble of peace that surrounded Isabella's childhood, a safe space between the cold stone walls of politics. Within that safe space, Isabella's education was carefully conducted. She learned not only the languages, music, and histories of both kingdoms, but also the intricate court etiquette of England. Her favorite lessons were with large maps, where she could trace the coastline with her tiny finger, visualizing the narrow strip of water that had once been a barrier, but now connected by her marriage. But her most important education came not from tutors, but from her friendships. She quickly became involved with the other children of the nobility, and her closest friend was Margaret Holland, a girl a few years older, but extremely knowledgeable. It was on quiet afternoons when the two girls sat embroidering in their private garden that Margaret became Isabella's guide into a world she had never known. Through whispers and stories, Margaret helped Isabella see the cracks beneath the glittering facade of the royal court. She began to understand the long-standing feuds between the families, the simmering dissatisfaction of the nobility with the rule of Richard, who they saw as too indulgent to his confidants and too soft on his old enemy France. From a child who saw only superficial splendor, Isabella gradually became a keen observer, recognizing the meaning behind the tense silences and fleeting glances at banquets. Her bubble of peace remained, but now she began to perceive the undercurrents that were churning just outside, threatening to engulf the fragile world in which she lived. The fragile bubble of peace that surrounded Isabella's childhood in England could not last forever, and it was shattered one day in early 1399. It began quietly with subtle signs that a sensitive child could sense. The atmosphere at court became strangely tense, smiles seemed strained, and conversations often died when she appeared. King Richard, her gentle guardian, changed too. His visits became less frequent, and when he did, his eyes were no longer clear, but heavy with worry and anxiety, often gazing out the window, as if waiting for a storm to break out. The storm did come, and it brought a name: Henry Bolingbroke. News of the king's exiled cousins returned to England with an army spread like a poisonous wind, and the nobles, long secretly discontented, quickly abandoned their allegiance to Richard and rallied to Henry's banner. The carefully constructed stability Isabella had known was crumbling at a terrifying pace. The collapse that came to the 9-year-old's world came not with the sound of swords, but with an order that was wrapped in the word safety. One evening, Isabella was told that she was leaving the Palace of Westminster for the Tower of London. It was both a palace and a prison, and in times of political turmoil, the line between the two functions often became blurred. She was now a prisoner in a gilded cage. It was here that Richard visited her for the last time. Gone was the proud and regal king, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged a decade in a few short weeks, his eyes filled with helplessness and despair. He knelt before her no longer as a king, but as a father, saying goodbye, explaining to her in the simplest terms his irreparable situation, a kingdom slipping away from his grasp, and a future from which he could no longer protect her. Soon after the final and most devastating change took place, Henry Bolingbroke deposed Richard and ascended the throne as King Henry IV of England. The former king was imprisoned, and news of his death at Pontefract Castle reached Isabella amid whispers of an unnatural death. At the age of 9, Isabella of Valois was a widow. Her last link to the life she had known to the man who had protected her had been cruelly severed. She was no longer Queen of England, but something else, a valuable political pawn, a noble prisoner in the hands of the enemies who had overthrown her husband. Her value now lay not in the peace she represented, but in the diplomatic weight she could wield in future negotiations with France. The fateful encounter had finally come. King Henry IV had come to see her in the very place where she was held captive. Isabella, a 9-year-old widow, stood face to face with a tall, powerful man with the calculating eyes of a politician and the steely gaze of a soldier. She could only bow in formality, while her entire future freedom or imprisonment, life or death, rested in the hands of the man standing before her. The new king looked at her, studying the child's incredible composure, perhaps calculating how to use this precious card for his new dynasty. For Isabella, the world had changed forever, and she had to learn to survive in a new reality where innocence was over, and the real game of survival had just begun. After years of tense negotiations and months of uncertainty, the door to France finally opened for Isabella in 1401. But the homeland she sought was no longer the familiar place in her 6-year-old memory. England had shaped her from her French accent, now tinged with an English accent, to her habits and her way of seeing the world. She returned a stranger in the land of her birth, feeling lost in a changed court. The Louvre was no longer a home, but a volatile political stage, where her father, King Charles VI, was consumed with fits of madness, and her mother, Queen Isabeau, was absorbed in her own power struggles. Isabella, the former Queen of England, was once again left to find her place a safe haven in the chaotic political currents of her own homeland. And then amid the turmoil, a spark of new life emerged. In 1406, when Isabella was 16, a proposal of marriage came from her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orléans. This marriage was very different from the first. Isabella was no longer a passive child, but a young woman who had experienced extraordinary events with maturity and a keen intellect. What attracted Charles was not her former status, but her character, the resilience and intelligence that had enabled her to survive unimaginable hardships. Their relationship was built on a foundation of respect and genuine affection, which blossomed into a deep love. Their court at Blois became an oasis of peace, a warm cultural center where art and poetry were cherished. For the first time in her life, Isabella is more than just a symbol or a political asset. She is truly loved and understood, has a true partner, and finds a happiness that seemed forever out of reach. But happiness in those times was fragile. Tragedy struck again in 1407, when Charles's father was brutally murdered on the streets of Paris. The assassination sparked a fierce civil war between her family's faction, the Orleanists, and the Burgundians. The peaceful atmosphere in Blois was shattered, and Isabella was thrust into the center of the storm. It was during this dark moment that her final and greatest transformation took place. She was no longer just a supportive wife, but a full-fledged political player. When Charles had to lead his army into battle, Isabella stayed behind managing his vast territories, coordinating logistics, engaging in diplomacy, and providing relief to the people suffering from the war. The once sacrificial pawn on the chessboard of kings had now become a powerful queen, making important moves on her own. Amidst those years of war and politics, life flourished. Isabella bore Charles 3 children, testaments to their love, but each birth took a toll on her. The price of motherhood in the 15th century was high, and after the birth of her 3rd child, Isabella's health was severely compromised. She had lived a full life in her final years, coming full circle from child, given up as a peace pawn, to queen widow, beloved wife, and finally a powerful leader. But that extraordinary journey ended too soon, leaving behind a legacy of courage and a story of triumph for a woman who refused to be a victim of fate. The short years of happiness could not fully heal the damage Isabella's body had suffered. Her health, already fragile after her last child, had slowly deteriorated. But in the face of her approaching death, Isabella showed no fear or despair. Instead, she showed incredible courage and fortitude. With the clarity of someone accustomed to facing great events, she spent her final days arranging the future of her children, ensuring that they would be protected and educated even in her absence. It was the final act of a mother, a leader, a person who had learned to control her own destiny in a world that had always sought to control her. She did not resign herself to fate, but proactively prepared for her departure with love and responsibility. The extraordinary journey finally came to an end on September 13th, 1409. Isabella of Valois breathed her last at the age of 20. Her death was not only a personal tragedy for her beloved husband, Duke Charles of Orléans, but also a great political loss for the Orleanists. They had lost not only a duchess, but also a wise counselor, a skillful diplomat, and a symbol of humanity who had helped rally popular support. The void she left behind made the Civil War all the more bitter and unpredictable, and the peace she had worked so hard to forge even more elusive. When one looks back on Isabella's life as a whole, one cannot help but see a profound paradox. She entered history as a political tool, a child used as collateral for a treaty. Her fate seemed to have been decided by others from a time when she was too young to understand what was happening. However, that is only the beginning, not the whole story. From that harsh situation, Isabella showed extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and courage. She did not simply accept her fate, but learned from it, adapted to it, and ultimately rose above it. Her true legacy lies not in treaties or battles, but in the life she lived. She demonstrated that even when treated as a pawn, one can still find space to act, to love, and to create a life of meaning. She turned an arranged political marriage into a deeply human relationship, and then forged a second marriage based on respect and true love. Her story is a profound lesson in human resilience in the face of adversity. It forces us to look beyond simple labels like child bride to see a complex person, a soul who struggled and shone. Isabella of Valois lived a short life, but her legacy is an enduring testament to the dignity and strength that lies deep within the human spirit, even in the darkest moments of history.